wish to turn it over now to Dr. Tonette Wood, who has been like reviewing NIH grants this morning.
No, submitting.
Submitting, oh, even worse.
Even more exciting.
So anyway, so she is at Tulane, where she is professor of medicine and of epidemiology, and associate provost, is it, or vice? Yes, associate provost, and a chair of various study sections and advisory committees, and she's going to tell you about R01 grant submissions and how to demystify the process.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, well, speaking of deans and how they can influence your experience, mine asked me about 5 or 6 weeks ago to get an R38 submitted. The deadline was today, so we were just waiting for the NIH reporter to come back and show that everything had gone through correctly before I could come give the presentation today. So thank you for accommodating the schedule. So I'm very happy to talk to you all about R01 grant submissions and ways and strategies that you may want to use to enhance your likelihood of success. How many of you have R01s? I'm guessing you don't, that you wouldn't be here. How many have submitted them? How many want to submit an R01? How many have to submit one? Okay, just to say that. Okay, great. So this is really a very exciting opportunity and a very important process for you and your career pathway and trajectory to either becoming physician scientist, I see some physicians here, or other independent investigators and scientists moving forward. My thoughts and words I'm going to share with you are not only as an NIH-funded investigator, but also as someone who has chaired a study section and reviewed these and served on the NIH CSR Advisory Committee. So there are a lot of feedback and suggestions and things that I've learned over the years, and hopefully that'll translate into something meaningful for you. So one of the first things, because there are several different grant mechanisms that are going to be talked about today, and my focus for the NIH, although they offer a host of different options for submitting grant applications, is the R01, and we're going to talk a little bit about what those are and how they perhaps are distinct from the others. We're going to talk about some of the key components of the application, only to let you know why it's important when you are going to be evaluated and when your application undergoes review. We're going to talk about some of the common problems that reviewers observe with NIH, with the R01 applications, but also give you some helpful hints and some strategies that you can utilize and think about and plan for to help you avoid some of those or overcome those challenges. And lastly, I'll talk briefly about the numerous resources that are available online through NIH website links, YouTube videos. I mean, you know, back when the dinosaurs roamed and I was writing my first R01, none of that was available. It was just trial and error, and you hope that you got it right. The availability of information and guidance for you all is there, but in some cases it's so much that it's hard to digest into something that's useful. So first of all, the R01 is the most common research grant mechanism that's utilized, particularly at the NIH. It is the oldest funding mechanism, probably heralded as the most competitive, not only in the US, but perhaps worldwide, as far as the review process and the competitive nature of achieving one of these awards. These are generally funded for 3 to 5 years. You hope for 5. Oftentimes now, and more recently, NIH is granting 4. These projects are used to support investigator-initiated, discrete, specified circumscribed research projects. So they're not big program planning grants or anything. They're hypothesis-driven, or intended to be hypothesis-driven, investigator-initiated grants to address a specific issue. These can be renewed through a competitive application process, so it's not guaranteed. And in more recent years, it has gotten more challenging to get a renewal on an R01, particularly if you're in the clinical research area, where they figure after you've done the clinical trial and you've answered the question, that doesn't need to be renewed, you need to move on to another area. There are multiple application dates, wonderful opportunities, 3 times a year actually, that you can submit your grants for R01. And if you're resubmitting, you also have 3 dates during the year to do it, and those usually follow a month after the standard deadline dates. So some of the things that are just important, you think, gosh, these make absolute perfect sense. although I'm still working with collaborators and we're going back to square one in the grassroots of how to prepare applications with some of these recommendations. The first is, whenever you are preparing one of these applications, read the instructions for the RFA or the FOA or whatever it is. Find out, one, if you're eligible, that if the question you're asking relates, if this is something that's of interest to the funding agencies, before you spend really many hours, weeks, months preparing and writing this. Read the instructions. There's a lot of pearls and wisdom in that. Many times when people are preparing their grant applications, they are thinking, well, everybody knows this. Everybody in your circle may know it, but don't assume that the reviewers do know it. You want to make sure that you're explicit in the information that you're providing. You want to make sure that you've done a comprehensive and thorough review of the literature, but you have to summarize it succinctly. I'd love to tell you there's a fast and easy way to do that. There isn't, but you need to accomplish it. Thorough and succinct summaries. You need to make sure that the rationale of your proposed investigation is clear, and that it is making sense in the general in the general approach that you are proposing. The tables and figures that you're including are very important. People want the breakup in the text in writing this. You want to make sure that what you provide, it's precious real estate. You only have 12 pages on an R01 application. It's precious real estate. Make it count, but think thoughtfully about it and make sure that they're accurate. You want a very organized and lucid write-up, and you have to obtain the pre-review from faculty at your institution or a consultant or someone. Have other people look at it. So when you first start thinking about an R01, these are just some of the initial ideas you must have in your mind and in your planning processes as you move forward with the next steps. Some of the helpful hints that come with this, because when you start working on it, you think you've got a brilliant idea, and I'm certain it is brilliant. And many of the people who do these grant writing retreats and programs and that sort of thing will say, but brilliant ideas are like a dime a dozen. A lot of people have them. What makes the difference between one that gets funded and one that isn't is how you prepare your application. So some things, everyone raised their hand. I guess you wouldn't be here if you hadn't, if you didn't need to be submitting an R01. But you want to at least come up quickly with some sort of title. You're going to be talking about this a lot. You want to give yourself about 6 months to prepare this application, and you want to call it something cute, whatever, nice, I don't know, however you want to do it, but give it a name. You need to draft your specific aims really early on, and something that you can vet with trusted colleagues, right? That you can look at and see whether or not these are making sense, they align with the instructions on the RFA or equivalent. After you get these specific aims outlined, you do have to work on the research strategy. And in the research strategy section are the elements that are the core of the evaluation and the review criteria. The significant and innovation sections, the significance is where your scientific premise, the whole reason that it matters that you do this work. And the second part is the innovation. What's creative about this? What's going to do it? Do those sections first. Those aren't the longest sections, but if you can't make a compelling case for why you're doing this, that's addressing your specific aims, it's going to be very difficult to develop an approach that's going to meet those. After you've done this and you've written, outlined your significance, your innovation, you start working on your approach, you want to make sure that you go back and you look at your approach and does it match with your specific aims. You design your experiments, you want to reevaluate them, make sure that this is hypothesis driven and that everything that you have included so far is aligning. And that takes multiple reviews to do that. You do need to make the time for the review for trusted colleagues, as I mentioned earlier, and then you can go further with the rest of the application. So the focus of this session, this is just so that you have a general idea of what you're going to be doing preparing, but the focus on this session is how do you understand about the review process and how you can be more competitive. So one of the first steps after you've prepared your application is you've got to get it to the right study section. I suspect all of us here who have submitted there have bombed on the study section, and if it had gone to another group, they would have understood the work and you would be in a different position, maybe focusing on something different. So you need to do homework well in advance about which study section. Talk to colleagues as well. You can't talk to members of the study section. You can find out who the standing members are, because if you're caught talking to them, then that could be an invasion of their conflict of interest and what they're able to do. So don't ask members, but you can talk to other people. You can even talk to your project officer if they have any suggestions or recommendations of a study section that might align well with what you're proposing. That's after you send your project officer your specific aim so that they know what you're talking about. So one way to make sure that it gets to the right study section is to not leave it in the hands of CSR. I think the Center for Scientific Review is wonderful. I was on the advisory council and I was a big supporter of that. But the thing is, they don't always understand where your research belongs. So write a cover letter. And in the cover letter that you can submit, you can suggest an institute or center assignment. You can request a reviewer assignment, a review assignment, not a reviewer. You can't, suggest that, but where it should go for review. You can identify individuals that are in conflict. For instance, if you are developing an innovative technique in basic science or anything else that's a direct competition with someone else that is an active member at NIH study sections, you probably want to say, give it to anybody but this person, and this is the reason why, because we're in comparable fields, or it's competitive. You can identify the areas of expertise that may be needed to review yours, especially if you're in something very novel, any sort of special circumstances, and you would need to make sure that you provide this information. The cover letters doesn't guarantee it's going to be assigned where you ask, but it can help provide useful guidance on where it should go. It's very important to know you can't suggest reviewers on the study section. So you can review, but you can't do the other. The review process is multi-step. As you can see, many thanks to my colleague Kathy Salida, one of the SROs at NIH, who provided this slide. But you can see once you submit your application, it goes to the Center for Scientific Review. Most of them go there. That's the centralized process, who assigns it to the study section. And the study section will review it for scientific merit. They don't make funding decisions. Then it goes to the institute that potentially could fund your application, and they evaluate the relevance and make funding recommendations. When they send it on to the advisory council and then on to the institute director. Okay, so it's a multi-phase process, but the most important hurdle to get over is the study section, because if it doesn't get past them, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks about your work, including the project officer that you've been working with at the institute. Okay, so the criteria, I think most of you, are you all familiar with these? Have you seen them? The criteria that the NIH is looking at: overall impact, which is the assessment of the likelihood for the project to exert a sustained and powerful influence on the research fields involved. And that's a statement you'll see in critiques that come back, whether or not it's a very good idea, but it doesn't exert a sustained and powerful influence. So think about that as you're writing your ideas and your thoughts. The core review criteria are the 5 that are listed here. The significance, in which now we refer to the scientific premise, must be embedded in that section. The investigators, innovation, the approach, and the environment. And the scores, the review criteria, are each scored on a scale of 1 to 9. A lower score is better. You want to be number 1 in this case. You're not looking for the higher number. As you are developing your application, and we've talked a little bit already about some of the sections that you would be writing, you see the review criteria on the left, and then you see what part of the application reviewers will look for that information. So for the significance and the scientific premise, they're going to look in the research strategy, your research plan section, which is a big portion of the application. For the investigators and how well they align with the goals of this application, they're going to look at the biosketches, and in particular the personal statement that you're going to include in your biosketch and all of your collaborating investigators. So take time with those. Don't attach one from another application you submitted 2 months ago or a year ago. Make sure it's tailored to this application. Innovation will also be looked at in the research strategy section. The approach, which is what you're really going to do, is going to be in the research strategy section, and the environment is going to be in the facilities and resources and in the in the environment section of the application. I will tell you, after serving many, many years on the NIH study section and continuing to do so, you can do well on all of them and not do well on approach, and it appears that your overall impact score is really driven by the approach. So the investigators can be 1s, your significance a 1, your innovation a 2, and the environment a 1, and the approach is a 5. And trust me, you're going to get a score between a 4 and a 5. And that's going to put you for your overall impact score, which is what the reviewers will vote on. So all these sections, everything is important. But if you can't deliver a clear, concise message that you can deliver on what you propose to do with a succinct, accurate, a believable approach, it'll end quickly. So something to know about your reviewers, and it's really important to know about. Now I've been a reviewer for a long time, and I've heard some people praise reviewers and some really deep six us. I mean, saying, they're tired, they're busy, they're reading it on the airplane, they've got their children screaming in the background, and that's when they're reviewing your grant. And probably everything you hear, both good and bad, is probably all true, right? It's all true. But I will tell you, you can't get on an NIH study section unless you're early career, unless you are an actively funded investigator by the NIH. That's who they choose. So these are busy people. They not only have their own grants, they're now reviewing others, and usually that's not their only job, right? None of us have just one job. You're teaching, you're doing service, you're traveling, you're doing all these things. The reviewers, everyone I have met, is highly committed to the process, but they're also highly committed to everything else they do. Okay? Their knowledge base is going to be broad. Not everyone selected to review your grant is experienced in your area. Matter of fact, you can plan on at least 1, possibly 2, not being directly related to your field. Basic science might be a little bit better. If you're in the clinical and population area, it can be all over the place. And so that's why it's very important that you provide a comprehensive review and don't assume they know anything. Explain the concept succinctly so that it's clear. And understand the time commitment to review these is substantial. Most reviewers will tell you it takes them between 4 and 8 hours to complete a full review and write up the summary for one R01 application. The good ones take less time. The good ones and the really bad ones take less time. I'll tell you, those go through 3 hours maybe. It takes that long just to read them. But then you have to write the reviews. The ones in the middle, where the bulk of them are, those are the ones that take the longest. Try in your application not to give them a reason to not think you're not in the best. So talking about the overall impact, which I said, this is what you've got to think about as you're designing your experiments and you're looking at the way you're communicating your grantsmanship, is whether or not you're communicating a sustained and powerful influence on the research field by the work that you're doing. Okay? That's the overall impact, and that's what's brought up at the end. We want your overall impact scores, reviewers. So got to think about that. Now, for significance, and all of these, the 5 criteria I mentioned to you are the ones that go into making up the score. Keeping an eye on my time, right? Okay. So the significance, and all of this is readily available on the website. You don't have to, worry about this or wonder if you're going to remember it. But the first thing you have to know and make very clear is that you are addressing an important problem or a critical barrier to progress in the field. You've got to be able to state it clearly and with enthusiasm, with some sort of big pearl data as your entrance sentence in the significant section on why it's important. Not something common, not something common like hypertension is a common chronic disease. Okay, great, that's exciting. Something much more compelling. It is the most important modifiable risk factor for cardiovascular disease, which is the leading cause of death in the U.S. Okay, well, it's a little more important than just it's a common chronic disease. So think about that. You need to make sure there's a strong scientific premise for your project, and that is backed by the literature identifying that there are gaps in the field and that your research is going to address that gap. You need to think, or how it's being evaluated in significance, is if your aims are achieved, that knowledge, technical abilities, whatever, the clinical practice are going to be improved. and you need to be able to bring that together and state it, and that successful completion of your project and achievement of the aims or whatever is going to lead to something that's going to drive the field in a new direction. Or if it doesn't work, like if you're doing some sort of R21, that it's going to at least let us know we don't need to look there anymore, that it's going to help us as we identify alternate interventions or alternate approaches. Now, the investigators are looked at very closely throughout the process, looking at the biosketch, the information that you provide in the section of the grant application. So they're looking to see, the reviewers are looking to see, are you well suited? How do they tell if you're well suited? They look at where you've published. They look at where you've been funded before. They look at whether or not you've shown the fire in the belly to move forward with first author publications, that you've done preliminary data, things of that nature that you're including in the grant. Early stage and new investigators, you all would likely meet those criteria, right? You haven't submitted one yet. Most of you look as though you are at that stage that you would be early stage and haven't achieved, you're within 10 years of your final training, whether it's a PhD or within 10 years of your clinical fellowship training, right? So if you meet those criteria, no matter what your actual age is, it's all based on your training, not on your actual age, then you may be appropriate, for some of the early stage investigator options and the things that are the benefits, which I'll talk about in a minute. But you're going to look at the record of accomplishment, which I've already said is going to be based on your publications and any other grant awards, either pilot awards or could be foundation awards, industry sponsored, or other small NIH grant awards. If you're doing a multi-PI, and those of you who are going in for your first R01, be very careful how you do that, because if you're just choosing a multi-PI that's a heavy hitter, a well-funded individual, you actually may be hurting your chances rather than helping them, unless you can clearly outline a compelling reason on why the two of you must come together on a grant. The early stage, as I've just mentioned, a new investigator within the 10 years of their terminal training, and why this is of benefit is because you get prioritization for funding. Essentially, a higher score will be eligible for funding from the NIH based on the fact that you would be designated as an early stage, which I think is important. It's also important for you all to know, because some people have had circumstances, birth of a child or whatever, that they might want to get extensions on that tenure. And I understand the process is pretty simple to do, and they're pretty liberal with the exceptions. So if you think you qualify, or you think you might qualify for one, please look at it and apply early before your time runs out. So innovation, again, is one of these areas. Either your work itself is going to shift the research, or you shift the field in a way that's going to be meaningful. A paradigm shift is what we talk about. But there are other ways to be innovative, and that could be that you're taking approaches or methodologies or interventions that are already in play, but you're applying them in a novel way or to a novel population, or you may be doing a refinement of interventions. So it's all in how you prepare the statements and provide that information on how you are this work that you're doing is moving beyond the status quo. And that is a very important part to do, and yeah. Not every project has to be innovative, but you need to make a compelling case on why it's important. It could be the scientific premise outweighs the innovation for your particular project. The environment is also important. It's not one that I see makes a big difference in driving your score to a better score, but when people neglect this section in their application, it certainly is an easy way to drive your score to a worse score. And that's if they don't see the evidence that the environment is going to contribute to the likelihood of success, that the institution has the materials and the support to make this work, and that the project will benefit from any unique features that are available either in your setting, your institution, or in the core labs that are available. So don't ignore it because it can be a problem. Now, approach is where, this is where I said, this is where everyone tanks. And there's a whole outline of things that you want to make sure you're paying attention to about the way you're communicating the strategy, that it's clear, that you are hypothesis driven in the work that you're doing, that if there are potential problems and alternative strategies, that you admit them. There are limitations, you admit them and you move forward. That you want to make sure that you're addressing any the areas around rigor, reproducibility, and transparency, and that if you have any issues around human subjects or animal research, that you're addressing those as well. Very important that you get this right, because this is where the biggest problems happen. This gives you an example of what the review template looks like. Very different than what they looked like when I first started reviewing, but by the time I was ending my term as chair of the study section, this is what we were at. So it's quite succinct. This is one section for significance. You get them for all the different. You're supposed to list 3, 4, 5 reasons of the major strengths, score driving strengths, and then 3 to 5, score driving weaknesses. And this is for each section. It's supposed to be limited to 1/4 of a page. So the amount of material that's being written and summarized is going to be limited, but very compelling if it's done correctly. There are other things that are brought into play that can affect your score. They don't affect as much as the primary ones, but don't think these don't matter. People who haven't addressed human subjects, haven't done inclusion and this lifespan approach, have not talked about biohazards when they're applicable, can drive the score worse in a lower, in a higher direction, but that means a worse score during the discussion part of the application. Rigor, reproducibility, and transparency are the areas that is more new to the NIH, and there's been a lot of focus on this. There have been concerns that many of the data that have been published and reported cannot be reproduced, and the concern is that perhaps the rigor has not been as closely monitored as one would thought, or that we haven't included the right groups. For instance, women, female mice, when you're investigating diseases that affect women, that's an important thing. And when you try to reproduce this or translate these basic science into human studies, but they haven't been tested in a model that's replicable, it's a problem. So these are very important aspects that the NIH is focusing on, and they are discussed as part of the review criteria. And where you see them, the elements of rigor are listed on the left-hand side: the scientific premise, the rigor, the consideration of sex and other biological variables, and if you were doing the basic science, the authentication of your resources. You can see across here in the section that they are considered. Most of them are in the research strategy. The scientific premise and the significance, the rigor is going to be in the approach, and the sex is a biological variable in the approach as well. So it's important that you clearly call out those words throughout your application as appropriate, and make sure that it's clear to the reviewers and to the NIH that you know, you're aware, and you're going to comply. So when you're looking at the scores from 1 to 9, as I said, a lower score is better. What you want is that score between 1 and 3. They multiply it by 10. Sometimes you'll hear people talk, "Oh, I got a 20," because they multiply it by 10. That's outstanding. 1 is exceptional, or a 10 is exceptional, to 3 or 30, which is excellent. Then you've got the middle group where most people fall, most of the reviews, and then you have the low impact, which happens to some reviews, but I didn't see that as often as I saw the moderate impact scores. But again, moderate impact, not in a fundable range typically, unless it's an area that's highly relevant to the institute and they want to fund it for other reasons. So common problems, these are the things with significance, is that the way the investigator presented it, it was nothing new, nothing compelling. There was nothing significant. There was no scientific need, no gap that was being filled. The reviewers would comment that the work was incremental and not paradigm shifting, and it was going to be low impact. So why do it? It's not going to affect a lot of people. Or it repeats prior work. So you've got to think that through. Look at these issues as you go through them. On the specific aims, the common comments that came from the reviewers in my study sections and in others is that the specific aims were overambitious. At early stages of your career, you think you want people to know that you've got these great big ideas and you can take on the world in 5 years and you can solve all the health problems. But in reality, people know that can't be done. Being overambitious is going to hurt you. So you need to have realistic aims that are going to be paradigm shifting, but appropriate for the scale and the scope and the timeline. Some cases, the research projects were not hypothesis driven. The secondary aim, this was a big one. You know, you've got 2 or 3 aims, and you write them to where you do one aim, but if based on the first aim, you're going to do the second aim. The reviewers will look at that, and that's an immediate off the table. They'll say, well, what happens if the first aim doesn't make it? And we're funding them another 3 years. No way. Your aims have got to be independent. If they're dependent on one another, it's gonna be dead in the water. It's sometimes the applicants did not make it clear on once you finish this, what are you going to do? Is it going to lead to an implementation trial? Is it going to lead to translation into human studies? What is it going to do? You want to make that very clear on your specific aims page, usually that last paragraph. In the methods section, these are the common problems we observed. Lack of preliminary data. If you're submitting an R01, I know it says if you're an early investigator, you don't have to have preliminary data, and that's true, and you hope someone advocates for you on the grant. But in reality, most people are looking for some evidence that you've collected preliminary data and that you have an idea of what you're doing. So if you have that opportunity, please try and include it. If it's not certain that you will actually have access to the data and the specimens that you need, that's usually determined through letters of support of people with established laboratories or people who have the cell lines or people who own the databases. You want letters of support. Insufficient description of key methods, inclusion of unnecessary information. Those become distractors. Don't do it. And if the hypotheses are not aligned with your specific aims, you're dead in the water. So make sure that you're looking at these things in your methods section. Again, this is in your report. More problems with the methods is that people forget to talk about the limitations and potential problems and what those alternate approaches will be. So make sure that you include that. 2 small paragraphs will do it. Lack of methodological expertise. If you're trying something for which you have no experience and no one on your team has adequate experience, your investigator will be low, and your method section, your approach will also be scored worse. And the reason, because they'll say, yeah, they've got a great idea, great, no one knows how to do the method. It'll never work. They'll never get it off the ground. And you'll likely be dinged in 2 areas. The lack of appropriate control group is another one if you're doing some sort of clinical trials or even in your animal studies and comparison studies. So common problems that are listed, and all of this is readily available on the website and that sort of thing, but other things that people have talked about with the investigative team is that the team is incomplete, doesn't have all the necessary expertise, lacking letters of support, which I already mentioned. If you need a specific access to something that's not in your institution, you better have a letter of support or even a letter from your dean saying they're going to give you the resources to do what you need to do. If the investigators have got 1% on the grant, people do this, and you're trying to make your budget work. Oh, I made my budget work. Oh, I'm giving them something for nothing. Everybody says they don't have enough time, they're not committed. The score will be worse. Uncertainty about the success of collaboration, and we see this a lot. That if people are saying you've got the best people from around the world, but they've never talked on the phone and they've never demonstrated they've worked together, it doesn't look like there's likelihood for success. And what are the ways that you can demonstrate that you are an effective collaborator? You co-author a paper together. You co-author a symposium. You co-present at something, or an abstract, but you demonstrate that you've worked together in some way. For the environment, common things that are noted is lack of institutional support or insufficient evidence that you'll have access to the resources that you need. So ways that you can overcome the challenges that we've talked about is, one, you definitely want to make sure that if you don't grab the attention and focus on the significance and the impact in the very beginning, and that's got to go not only through your specific aims, the beginning of your significance section, but also in your narrative and your summary, you've got to grab that attention and you've got to make it exciting, something that people care about. If you're not sure, because we are nerd-like individuals in research, have someone else look at it. See, does it make them excited about the research you're doing? If it's someone in another lab or something, does this really make you interested in what I'm doing? Be very clear about your project and the hypotheses that you are stating. Don't assume too much. Make sure that you're being realistic. Note the study's limitations. Proofread, 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 and proofread. Check your paragraphs, check your things. That's one of the things that we got caught in this morning, was that in the fourth proofreading, we realized that some of the tables or the figures, we looked at them so many times, didn't realize that they weren't matching with some of the text. So something had to change, either the text or the figure, but they needed to match, right? And then really have someone else who isn't so close to it, who hasn't looked at your application so often, read your application, edit it. They'll see things that you just cannot see anymore. As you go through this process, and you're dealing in the NIH world, welcome. It's so exciting. Please be flexible and get some really thick skin, really thick skin. You want to carefully review and consider any of the critiques you get, either pre-submission, post-submission. Make sure you're discussing this with your mentors if you can, and trusted colleagues, because it's good to get other perspectives. Realize that the funding environment is very competitive. We used to say harsh. It was very harsh several years ago. It's still pretty harsh, but not as bad. But it is very competitive. If it were easy, everyone would be in this business. Make sure that you plan accordingly to revise and to resubmit. My first R01 was after the third submission. First one, triage. Second one, scored, but not low enough to get funded. Third time, it was in the door, responded to the critiques, and it was in the door. It's not for the faint-hearted. It takes time. And perseverance. You can do it, but just you need to stay with that process. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, the resources that are available to you all, it's almost so many that you don't know which ones to go to, but it's first, or how many to do it. And what you do is you need to get some guidance on which ones would be most important. NIH has a whole host of online resources, helpful tools, YouTube videos, all sorts of things where people are talking about some of the stuff I just talked about, the common mistakes, the common problems, and ways that you can mitigate those. Some of you have got outstanding mentors. Some of you don't have mentors that are as outstanding with respect to their access to resources. They have their approach, it's worked for them, but it may not be working for you. Know that there are other things out there and access them to enhance you. So do your homework, plan to work very hard, be realistic about the process and know that it's going to take time. Seek out and act on the constructive criticism. But I'm going to tell you, when it does hit, and it will hit if you stay with it and you stay on course, it is one of the most rewarding experiences you will ever have. So, not for the faint-hearted, and I thank you for your attention. Any questions?
Since we're running fairly well on time, if anyone has some questions, we can take a few.
Question about, I was reading the instructions, and one of the things that jumped out at me is you need to critique and highlight the limitations of the previous work in the field. And I was wondering if you could comment the most appropriate way to do that, given that some of that work is probably about the people that are reviewing your grant, and the balance between not being overly critical but also highlighting the limitations.
You do have to be politically savvy, I would say, as you go through. So you want to be thoughtful and constructive in your review of the prior literature. You don't want to miss anything either, because then if you have others that are there who are reviewing it, so how did they miss that? It's a huge gap, right? But I think you have to be very thoughtful in how you do it, rather than saying something as you could observe, this is the worst study ever, horrible methods or whatever. You could say that the prior work was limited in its ability to fully address the methods, the most up-to-date methods and techniques, or access to populations that could properly address the question.
Techniques that were not available.
Right. So, but you can't not include it. But you can say that data are limited, and the methods, the studies to date are inconsistent. That sort of thing. That gives the reviewers an indication that you're aware, that you understand the question hasn't been answered, and that your study is going to improve on those limitations by doing X, Y, and Z. Okay?
Dr. Rocky.
So that was absolutely spectacular.
Oh, well, thank you, Dr. Rocky.
I even learned something. Just a comment to your question. So one thing you can do if you're resubmitting, you get a list of who reviewed who was on the study section, and sometimes depending on the subject matter, you can sort of figure out who may have reviewed the grant. And so sometimes you might want to play to that.
That's an excellent idea, let me add to that. When you are preparing to submit and you know which study section it's going to, the list of the standing study section members are available on the NIH website. One of the reasons you want to make sure you start on this process 6 months in advance, not 6 weeks on my R38 I just submitted, but that was different. It wasn't an R01. But that you want enough time to go and look at the people that you think might be in an area relevant to yours. Look up their publications in PubMed and make sure that you're referencing them in your application as appropriate. Okay?
The comment, I just want to make that there are a lot of young people here, so I sit on NIDDK EDNC, which is the subcommittee, the review panel that reviews K awards. So Ks are a little bit different than ours. We are trying to give people this award. We are trying to hand out money to trainees. So it's challenging, but you can't win if you're not in. So if you have any questions, go for it.
So, these are the best years of your professional life. That's what we're saying. I think this is true, and the focus at NIH and others, as you can tell, the funding priorities given to early stage investigators and the compassion and the enthusiasm that the study section members and the institutes have make this an ideal time to be a junior investigator. So those of us who are a little more seasoned, this is less of an ideal time for us. It makes it a little harder, but it's the perfect time for you all. So please take advantage of the time, the resources, and the opportunity. It truly is the most rewarding professional activity I have ever done. Thank you.